to hit the record button. Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon or perhaps even good evening to everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the last event in our Future of Architectural Education series. I'm Douglas MacLeod, the chair of the Center for Architecture at Athabasca University. And I just wanted to note that Athabasca University has staff and students in 84 different countries around the world. And as such, many of us live and work on the traditional lands of Indigenous people. I myself live on the unceded territory of the Silex Nation, and we honor their ancestry, heritage, and gifts of all these people and nations. And I would encourage you to share your own land acknowledgement in the chat. We also support the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and hope that we can act as allies in realizing recommendations such as the call to action number 7, which states that we call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. This is particularly relevant to the series that we're all part of now, which is focused on the future of architectural education. For a number of years, we have worked with partners around the world on a global studio, and we hope in the near future to renew that project, and we would invite you all to be part of it. The project did demonstrate the breadth and depth of architectural programs and approaches around the world. And the most valuable thing about that global studio, however, was the network of people it brought together to collaborate and share their work. So throughout this lecture series, we've been building a new kind of network, and just touching base with some of the people who have spoken at it has been a really energizing experience for me. Today, as we conclude the series, we're very fortunate to have Phil Bernstein with us. Phil is an associate dean and professor adjunct at Yale School of Architecture, and he's taught there since 1988, where he received both his Bachelor of Architecture and his Master's of Architecture. He's also a former vice president at Autodesk, where he was responsible for the company's building information modeling strategy that included the development of the Revit platform. And prior to joining Autodesk, Phil was an associate principal at Caesar Pelli and Associates, where he managed many of the firm's most complex commissions, including projects for the Mayo Clinic, Washington National Airport, and Goldman Sachs. He's the author of both Architecture Design Data, Practice Competency in the Era of Computation, and also Machine Learning, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. He's a senior fellow of the Design Futures Council and a former chair of the AIA's Contracts Documents Committee. So I'm delighted to welcome Phil this morning, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks, Douglas. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody today. I got an interesting assignment, which was to try to speak coherently about the implications of artificial intelligence for the education of architects. I think both of those topics are a little contested, so it'll be interesting to try to explore this issue without a lot of well-resolved pedagogical principles. I teach in a master's degree program where this question of artificial intelligence was barely beginning to emerge when our current third-year students were first-year students. So things are moving pretty rapidly, and I'm going to give you a kind of smorgasbord taste of some of the things, at least, we've been talking about and thinking about here at Yale, and that I've been thinking a little bit about during the course of my career and in a recent book that I wrote. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. I hope that I share the correct screen. Let's see, that looks right. So let's jump in. I want to start with this image by two of my colleagues, Joyce Sang and Bimal Mendes, who did a project a few years ago called The City of 7 Billion. And they were working on this question of how various kinds of networks, transportation networks, supply chain networks, and information networks create a view of the world that is different than the view of the world that we have today, because the interconnection of data points around the globe gives us a different way of looking at a whole series of problems. In their case, they were treating the globe essentially as a giant city, but the work in the images really, in a lot of ways, previewed the context in which a lot of the technologies that have been worked on that have currently culminated into this idea we call artificial intelligence have converged. Because the theories, and I'll talk about this in a little while, but some of the theories of machine autonomy, machine intelligence, have been around for many, many decades, but we needed a convergence of large amounts of interconnected data and huge amounts of compute power to get us to the moment that we are in today. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in a second. So in 2021, the Royal Institute of British Architects asked me to write a book about artificial intelligence, and they did so because Neil Leach, who was one of the leading thinkers on this question in the UK, had been asked to write a book about the future of architectural practice in an era of AI. And I guess Neil just refused to do it. He said, I think this is a terrible thing that's going to be just highly destructive to our profession, and I don't think it's a good idea to be exploring that topic, or at least that was my understanding. I, undaunted, however, decided that I would kind of jump into this. And so I wrote this book called Machine Learning Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. It came out in the middle of 2022, probably a good 2 years before it should have, but who knew? And I think my thesis in this book, which we'll explore in a little bit more detail during this talk, was essentially to say, in order to understand the implications of technology, you really have to explore three sets of questions. What are the processes that architects are involved in that might be affected by technology? Secondly, how is their agency and their relationship to the systems in which they operate actually changed? And thirdly, what sorts of opportunities does technology offer architects in the context of process and relationships where we might be able to leverage these new kinds of technologies? And so thematically, that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, because I think in some early form, these questions have implications for ultimately how we train the architects of tomorrow. And so one of the ways I set the context for that, and the way I do it with my students, is from this book from Richard and Daniel Susskind that was written in 2015. Daniel's an economist. Richard is his dad, who's a lawyer. And they write a lot about the implications of artificial intelligence for the professions. And they talk about this idea they call the grand bargain. And the grand bargain is this concept that we have created this class of professional people, like architects and doctors and lawyers, in whom we invest a tremendous amount of trust, and we give them a lot of exclusive agency, and in theory, we pay them a fair wage, but that's a different discussion. We give them independence, autonomy. They have rights of self-determination, and professionals really act with a tremendous amount of personal agency in society. But what the Suskins also said was automation is going to dramatically change the relationship between professionals and the society that they serve, that automation is going to transform our work, and that they posit that the professions will be dismantled incrementally by autonomous artificial intelligence algorithms. Now, in 2015, when they wrote this book, this was prior to the acceleration of what we now know as the large language and diffusion models, which I'll get to in a minute, and was really based on a thesis that the capabilities of these algorithms was essentially unlimited, and that they will eventually reach a state of what's called artificial general intelligence. I actually disagree with that proposition, and I will explain to you why that is. But in my book, what I tried to do was, and I use this construct with our students here, look at what the implications of technology, this kind of technology, might be in the four primary roles that architects play in the systems of delivery. We protect the public's health and safety. We act as agents and experts to our clients. We guide builders to convert our design intent to actual constructed projects. And we run teams of other people that do the same thing. And so what I looked at in my book was this question of what are the two potential scenarios of either how artificial intelligence might augment our role or eliminate our role. And it's really that tension about the possibility of augmentation versus replacement that is the thread that runs through this whole question of what's going to happen to us as a profession, and therefore how we go about teaching our students. But there's an alternate model to this very diagrammatic idea of what architects do, and it was a model that was introduced by my friend Paulo Tombesi, who's a labor economist in Australia. And when I was working on a book back in 2006, where Paulo put forth in one of his essays that he contributed to our book, he put forth an idea that the problem of the design of a building can't be narrowly drawn as a design to execution problem. That design is actually a phenomenon of a lot of different design related activities. And Paulo was espousing this idea that what we need to do as architects is have what he calls flexible specialization. The building design is this interconnected network of lots of design related activities, and that architects need to be less pedantic about design with a capital D as simply a question of building formulation, form making, and solution. I think that's these two contrasts between my four roles and Paulo's idea of flexible specialization is really interesting because it emerges in parallel with this idea that this big data network that we operate in exists at all levels of a design problem. In my 2018 book, Architecture Design Data, I talked about this idea of each element of a project. In this case, I drew a small air handler, has this collection of information and characteristics that in the aggregate create a self-reinforcing data phenomenon. And so if you combine these three ideas, that the design is a flexible phenomenon, that there's different dimensions of information about each piece of the building that we work on, and that artificial intelligence strategies might reinforce these two questions, you'll see that my argument falls largely on the side of augmentation rather than elimination. And I'll try to reinforce that as we go through the rest of the discussion today and talk about where I think the real opportunities are, both for the technology and for us as teachers. But I think before we do that, we got to have some grounding in what this technology is all about and have some common terms of kind of explanation. And so in all my years as an architect who used technology as a vendor when I worked for Autodesk, I kind of distilled my whole theory of the evolution of technological typologies in architecture. I got it down to one slide. Back when I was at Autodesk, it was 20 slides. I've managed to consolidate it now down to one slide that basically makes the following argument. There have been and will be, up to within the context of the technologies we understand, 5 distinct eras of technological evolution for us as architects. And as technology has evolved, our ability to represent designs with higher degrees of representation and higher degrees of machine-based automation increase over the timeline. And so on the left-hand side of my diagram is what we did for several thousand years, which is draw stuff on pieces of paper, right? Making notations on pieces of paper has a lot of benefit. It's incredibly cheap, it's really fast, and it's reproducible. And so we used the language of orthographic description, plan, section, elevation, for a really long time. Until the, say, mid-1980s, when computer-aided drafting became cheap enough, the software and the hardware became available enough that architects began adopting it. Now, there's a history of CAD going back to the 60s and 70s with architects, but wide-scale adoption didn't happen until the mid to late 80s. And what that allowed us to do was draw things on pieces of paper faster and more accurately. Gave us some geometric facility, but really we were doing the same thing. We're just using computers to do the same thing. Sometime around 2008, which was, at least from my perspective, about 5 or 6 years after Autodesk made the proposition that the next thing after CAD was BIM, we begin to see the widespread adoption of building information modeling, which is a paradigmatic shift. And what building information modeling did was invert the representational paradigm from using drawings to represent a super abstract thing that was in the head of the designer to representing that super abstract thing as a three-dimensional model with parametric characteristics from which the drawings were a report. And there was actually an opportunity there for a paradigm shift in not just the way we represented things, but in our relationship to data. And I would argue that even though it was a platform shift, we're still doing the same damn thing we were back in 2500 BC, which is now we're just using building information modeling to draw things even faster. So what these technologies do is give you strong indications of what the first urges that architects have with new technologies. Draw stuff and make forms, right? Make better working drawings and draw curvy things or make blobs or whatever. So between 2008 and say where we're going to be next year, there's been a huge explosion in digital tools, but those digital tools are generating tons of heterogeneous, disorganized, what Mario Carpo in his book Beyond Digital calls meaningless mess of data, completely unrelated to each other. And so there's a ton of digital information out there, but none of it is particularly organized. And so what that digital explosion may create the possibility of, and we're seeing that happening pretty rapidly right now, is what I think will be the fifth era, where artificial intelligence will insert itself not just in the organization and generation of stuff that we need as architects, but also making sense out of all this information that's out there, because there's tons of it. And so what will happen is, it's happening right now, we have discontinuous levels of precision because these tools don't relate to one another, and we have discontinuous levels of automation. So you may be able to use 6 digital tools, but they don't relate to one another. So you get varying degrees of automation in that process. And what AI may do is make that automation process easier. And you're starting to see early signs of that, because one of the things that AI is really good at is writing computer code. And computer code is about logics, and it's logics that we need to move forward from this. Now, personally, just a little bit of my history. I, by total coincidence, have been involved in this discussion in some form or another since I was a college student in the 70s. I was studying architecture as an undergraduate. I was also very interested in computer science before computer science was what it is today. We were writing code on giant mainframes and then eventually mini computers. And I stumbled across a young professor here at Yale who just by coincidence turned out to be one of the founding fathers of natural language processing, a guy named Roger Schenck. And back in the 1970s, in the kind of late Minsky era, and when Professor Schenck was working, the theory was you could teach a computer with rules to parse language, and you could parse that language in such a way that a computer could reason inferentially about a context. And so for a while, there were these script-based tools. You see, this is actually my homework assignment from sophomore year in college. We were writing in a language called Lisp. It was on this computer, which was a PDP 1145 mini computer that there were 11 of us working on hand-built terminals in the computer lab. And my assignment was to write a script in Lisp that would allow this computer to read newspaper stories about oil tankers. And you can see little evidences of that in here. And I got a B- on this assignment because the TA said my script couldn't tell the difference between a car accident and an oil tanker crash. Meanwhile, one day, my sophomore year, when we were working in the lab, our PDP 1145 exploded into flames, literally into a fireball. They were pressing the processor on this thing so hard. And this machine that you're seeing here, which took up this much space, by the way, had about 1/10,000th the compute power of my phone today. So you can see the convergent problem here. A theory about how much information was going to be needed to understand the world and zero compute power. So we have the AI revolution of the late 70s happened again in the mid 80s with these things called expert systems. Nothing really worked, or frankly, happened in the public consciousness until around 2010, when IBM built this machine called Watson that won Jeopardy. And everybody thought, and this thing was good, right? It answered in the form of a question. It could understand jokes. It creamed this guy on the left, Jennings, who I guess is now the host of Jeopardy. And everybody thought, this is it. We've reached a threshold of artificial intelligence where really important new things are going to happen. And so they set this computer to doing things like curing cancer and doing other important projects, none of which worked. The Watson team was dismantled. I understand it's coming back in the form of Watson Ultra or Watson Plus, but in any event, that kind of pre-theoretical idea that just indexing a lot and searching information would form artificial intelligence didn't really work until we get to 2017. And in 2017, some researchers from Google write a paper about these tools called pre-trained transformers, which are essentially the idea of what's called a neural network that takes a large corpus of information, like all the words on the internet, breaks them down into billions of little pieces, and then creates a giant statistical matrix that allows that big pile of word chunks to be extremely predictive about when a word X happens, what's the likelihood that the next another word is going to happen. In other words, it's essentially a giant statistical model. And they use a series of techniques to train it. And there really hasn't been a technological jump, guys, since 2017. These GPTs, these generative pre-trained transformers, are the basis of today's large language models. The difference between 2017 and 2024 is the amount of energy, water, compute, and data that are thrown at these things. And that amount of information is huge. So that's on the language side. On the image side are these things called diffusion models that essentially take information about pictures and pixels on the internet, and use a bunch of math that I don't understand to try to generate diagrammatic output based on text prompts. So I thought it'd be fun. I gave a talk a couple weeks ago. I thought it'd be fun to ask ChatGPT to draw me a diagram of a diffusion model to explain, because I'm an architect, I like to see diagrams. This is what I got, right? Just gobbledygook. It's complete gobbledygook. And the reason it's gobbledygook is neither a generative model, a GPT, or a diffusion model has any innate understanding in the sense of human understanding about things like causality. What they do understand is relationships, lots and lots of relationships. And so the existential question here, and the one that you'll have to answer for yourself as an educator, is a causal model of the world enough to do important, interesting things? Now, of course, as architects, what we like to do with any new technology is generate lots of images. And the images that come from these tools are extremely compelling, if inaccurate. I did these a couple of months ago. These are drawings of American century homes updated for modern times. On the left, I asked DALL-E to draw me some plans. The images are very compelling. The plans are completely useless, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So you see these images and you think, these things really understand what a three-dimensional building is, but they don't. What they understand is what a picture of a three-dimensional building is. And where they don't really completely understand things, they do a lot of really weird stuff. So if I show my mom this picture from Stable Diffusion from January, she'd think that was a house, very much like the one her brother lives in New Jersey. But when you start looking at it, it's got a lot of really weird stuff. Look at those roof lines. And look at that thing in front of the front door, which is not, it's actually got two front doors. It's like a dream of a house. And that's really what it is. It's a dream of a house. And one reason for that is that spatial reasoning is very hard to do statistically. I have a colleague in the computer science department and I were discussing these two images that came recently from ChatGPT. On the left, create a picture of an empty room with no elephant in it. Absolutely no elephant anywhere in the room. Here's the image I got. I've created another, they're always so happy, ChatGPT is such a happy thing. I've created another image of an empty room with no elephant in it. If there's anything more you need, feel free to ask. Okay, I'm going to ask you to get the elephant out of the room. Now, why is it, or here on the right? Draw me an elephant in a pickle jar held by a lizard, standing on the shoulders of a rhino, standing in a bowl of cherries. Okay, all the pieces are there. But because there's no spatiality to it, the thing can't reason about basic three-dimensional relationships. Worse, on the left, the reason there's an elephant in the room is because of the preponderance of the phrase an elephant in the room, which is a well-known English phrase for talking. Everybody knows that something terrible is happening and nobody will talk about it. What's the elephant in the room? And so to me, in terms of the problems that we solve as architects, this fundamental lack of causal reasoning, understanding the relationship of things in space is problematic. Now, that's not to say that you can't get some compelling stuff. 2 months ago, I asked for this, a three-dimensional cutaway architectural drawing of a hospital color-coded by department with floor plans shown around the perimeter. Now, that is a compelling image. And that, by the way, I asked ChatGPT to describe what it had drawn, and this is what it described. So I said, oh, that's very interesting. Can you draw me a plan? And this is what I got. Now, it's been several decades since I was a healthcare architect early in my career, but this ain't a hospital. No, nowhere close. So I thought, what the hell? I did it again last night, like 10 o'clock last night. Here's my more recent hospital, same prompt. At least it's starting to look like a floor plan now, but a floor plan, which is a several thousand-year-old representation of a set of extremely complex relationships, is a very challenging thing for something that has no fundamental understanding of anything to generate. And so, given the fact that I'm going to posit that large-scale architectural problems, and by large scale, I mean involving the solving of more than 2 or 3 variables, are far beyond the capabilities of these systems. Well, what are they useful for? What can we actually use them for? So here's one that we're looking at right now. There's a lot of these tools out on the internet now. This one's called LCM Painter, and it tries to guess what you're drawing with a crude sketch, which, as an inspiration, assuming in this particular case you're looking for a gingerbread house, is kind of interesting, right? It's an interesting provocation. And if you do that sort of work with a well-curated and very large parametric data set, like in Zaha Hadid's office, they actually use this tool as a form generator, which makes a certain amount of sense because they have a well-curated data set that they can use for training. And given their work product and the tool's ability to make provocative images, image making as a vector makes a certain amount of sense given the state of the technology. But what I argued in my book is that to fall in love with the image generating capabilities or to get completely seduced by the idea that these things are capable of replacing architects wholesale is not just a waste of intellectual energy, it's a missed opportunity, both professionally and pedagogically. And so what I tried to argue in my book is the following. All the stuff in the green boxes down below here are data sets that currently exist that we generate as part of creating the built environment. Design assets on the left, information about the environment, evaluation, simulation, analytical models, CM data during construction, and ultimately building operations data. The technologies are beginning to evolve now that can accomplish 2 things. One is putting all this stuff in a common data environment, and all the big vendors, including my former employer, are working on this. Autodesk has BIM 360. I don't really follow what Trimble and Bentley and those guys are doing, but everybody's got the same idea. A combination of gluing these things together in something that is starting to emerge called a digital twin, and all these new kinds of AI processes give us the possibility to have a more logical and rational set of AI-based processes that are not about form making or language generation. It's about automation of certain aspects of design tasks, evaluation of design decisions, automation on the construction site, and automation of asset operation. And that we really ought to be thinking both from an academic and a professional perspective about what those kinds of opportunities look like. And so you're starting to see little glimmers of this in the emergence of the technology, just little glimmers, right? So these are my former colleagues from Autodesk who made a very expensive acquisition of a tool called SpaceMaker last year. They converted it into a platform, a next generation design platform they call Forma, which is a combination of conceptual form making and now analysis tools and artificial intelligence-based option generation. And what they're trying to do is get their arms around the question of what's the secret sauce of understanding a problem, creating a series of surrogate models, and providing AI-based analysis of certain parameters, certain characteristics of that design. In this case, it's wind flow and acoustics and energy flow, but they've isolated a series of potential outcomes. So that's what's happening at a large scale with the sort of platform providers. There are other possibilities, right? There are lots and lots of these tools out there. I'm going to skip forward to show you this quickly. We follow this little database called AI and AEC, which is a guy out there, this guy, Stefan Molkovich. Yes, of course, my cat will always come in here and complain when I'm presenting. This AI and AEC database tracks every AI company on the planet that they know of doing AI related work. When we first started watching this a couple months ago, it had 250 companies. It now has almost 800 companies in the database, and there's billions of dollars being invested here. What comes of it? Who knows? At least first the guy started with a list. At least now he's categorizing them by concept design, detailed design, and so forth. You might want to take a look at this just to see what's happening. But in terms of the questions that I asked at the beginning of the talk, I want to suggest to you that where we need to think about this problem is where AI is being applied at the existential level of our profession. And there are a couple of it. There's one particular example that I just want to use because these guys have been at it for a while. This is a company here in the States you may be familiar with called Upcodes. And what Upcodes does is code analysis of Revit models. And it's not deep, profound stuff. Is this bathroom big enough for handicap accessibility? Is this 2-hour wall in the right place? Is this stair the right width? And they've gone from this tool, which is a kind of Revit plugin, to this tool. I'm going to get music now, great. Which is a tool that reads code analysis and does a code evaluation for you. And when that begins to happen, now we're talking about replacing the architect's role as the protector of the public's health and safety, which is an existential problem, and suggests that perhaps our attention to these kinds of tools might want to be on larger questions of what we're attempting to do as practitioners. And so what I have argued in my writing and in my academic work is that we need to rethink the relationship between design and technology in a way that deploys these kinds of tools like artificial intelligence tools and this constellation of data in a way that is about outcomes, choosing outcomes that we want to get to. And so these early AI-based tools that you're seeing, like Upcodes or SpaceMaker or Forma, are all about isolating a particular set of outcomes and then getting to those outcomes. And we need to decide as a profession what we think are the priorities around that question and how we want to train future practitioners to do that. Now, unfortunately, well, maybe that's a value judgment. What's largely happening now with students is they are attracted to the tools that are most proximately interesting to their day-to-day work in studio, which is really about image generation. So I want to give you a couple of examples of this. This is some work being done by Andrew Klum and Chris Tomiko down at the University of Miami. And it's an interesting exploration. They taught a course last fall called Documentation and Reproduction, where they took a Rhino model of a space, and then they asked their students to use AIs to do various renders of that space. So you can see here a series of images. You know, this is a watercolor, this is a pencil sketch, another pencil sketch, a series of alternatives. And really what you're seeing there is the first experimentations with this what is essentially a very narrow set of capabilities around image generation. And I don't know about your students, but we see a lot of this with our students right now, because they're essentially experimenting with how they can produce the artifacts of design studio with these image generators. But it's very early days because the image generators are highly uncontrollable, and they are also about to cross over from free to paid tools. And they have a lot of other implications that I don't think anybody's thinking about. I want to dive in. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that there's no emergent coherent pedagogy coming here. I'm just showing you pieces of things that are things at least that we've been thinking about here. Last year, we began to realize that some of these platforms may be useful for lots of reasons, and we wanted to build our own capabilities here at Yale. So we built our own version of a large language model called Minerva. Minerva, by the way, is named after this statue of Minerva, who is the god of design that lords over studio space, which you see on the right, which at this particular moment, when this picture was taken, our students were playing badminton in there, which is what they tend to do when we're not doing pinups. But we have a lot of tech in our building. It requires a lot of support. The first thing we did was train a internal language model on how to do technical support for our students. So when somebody needs help with a 3D printer at 3 o'clock in the morning, when my technology staff is not there, they can get an answer. And this was our way of solving a problem and also learning more about these large language models. And then this platform, Minerva, I'll show you, I used for a research project myself. We're also trying to teach our students how to use the various kinds of technologies that are available to do image control. This is ControlNet, which is a pretty well-known one. We've been building a couple others ourselves. This gives the students a modicum of control over image generation, but it's still not anything where we're seeing finished work yet. There was an interesting example actually recently from a desk crit that I heard about last semester, where a student was presenting her work at a desk crit to a design critic, and the critic, who was a millennial or a baby boomer, said, "You know, these images, they remind me a little bit of the paintings of Norman Rockwell." And the student said, "Who is Norman Rockwell?" Which was a bit of a problem. And so we explained who Norman Rockwell was, and the student then went out, looked at a whole series of Norman Rockwell paintings, extracted some figures from the Norman Rockwell paintings, and then used the AI to insert that's great. Use the AI to insert the Norman Rockwell images into her renderings. So, I mean, this is not high profundity stuff, but you can start to see the early opportunities of playing with the artifacts of design around this question. Now, we're also starting to do some teaching around this question, and this has really only been happening for the last 2 years or so. And our teaching really falls into two categories. My colleague Brennan Buck has been teaching a series of seminars on the implications of AI for design. This is one he's teaching right now called The Black Box: Architecture in an Age of Opacity, where he's examining the question of what does it mean as a designer to deploy a tool that is completely opaque? the inputs, you do not understand the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. And so those folks are generating a series of design exercises to try to explore that implication for design. My colleague Sam Omans, who's a historian, and I have been teaching this course called Architecture and Machine Intelligence in Theory and Practice, where we've looked at the history of technology in architecture, how AI is the terminus of that particular trajectory, and what the implications are for ethical practice, the relationship to this means of supply and construction, and what the potential implications are. And our students are doing a range of projects from theory papers to highly speculative narratives about the future of artificial intelligence. Here's some work from Brennan's course from last semester called Altered States. These are all AI generated images. But what we realize now is that, oh, and this is, I just thought you might find this interesting. This is the diagram that Sam and I used to generate our syllabus this semester. We realized that there were sort of 5 big questions about the use of the intersection of technology and the work of the architect: ideation, agency, representation, aesthetics, and ethics. And then we wanted to examine 5 questions about authorship, skills, project delivery, regulation, and knowledge. And so we mapped our syllabus as an intersection of these 2 sets of questions in a sequence that we used to try to develop a series of arguments that would build the students' understanding of how artificial intelligence was going to affect their potential careers. And it was okay. It was very challenging conceptually, but and we're teaching our last class on Friday, number 11. But what we decided was we needed and the interest right now, the theoretical interest in the school is pretty minimal, although what's happening on the desktops of our students is pretty large. So we feel as if we need to teach a broader platform course next year. So I'm going to show you a little bit of our design idea for this platform course next year. We're trying to figure out how to organize this thing because there are a whole series of vectors that you could potentially use. And so what we decided to do was, and these diagrams are by Brennan put these together, and I think they're really smart. We started with this definition of sculpture from an essay by Rosalind Krauss, the sculptor, called Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And she was trying to look at the relationship between the act of sculpture and its relationship to different kinds of sites and different theoretical, what she calls axiomatic structures. And so we converted that into this diagram that we used to build our next syllabus, where we felt like there were 4 sort of general categories that a next generation AI course would need to focus on. The context and the environment of the technology, the disciplinary culture of what's happening with architecture, the means of production and practice, meaning firms and business models, and the digital infrastructure of what's happening. And what we decided we were going to do in this next course is try to make sure that we accomplished a series of goals around making sure the students were literate about the platforms, making sure they understood what the landscape looked like, making sure they understood what the risks of the use of the technology were, a historical argument about how we got to the place of where AI is, the relationship of other types of representation to AI representation, some use cases, some skills work, and finally implications for agency. So I'm going to show you, with the gentle permission of my collaborators, Sam, Brennan, and I are going to teach this course next year. It's going to be an AI platform that we're going to teach in the spring. And we've decided to organize it into 4 buckets, starting at the centroid, which is what these AI models are capable of doing. You're seeing the diagram of the course on the left and the very emergent syllabus that we're working on the right, where we're going to start by letting the students put their hands directly on the models so they can get a sense of what the different types of models are, what's the difference between a language model and a diffusion model, how to mobile models work. Then based on that, we're going to look at a broad survey of all the applications out there, and let the students evaluate what they think is happening. Then we'll get to the larger question of what the implications are for the discipline around authorship and sort of commercial questions, and then ultimately get to a question of social impact. And everybody will do a project related to a question that they'll choose. Our students have to do what we call selective work, which is electives in certain categories in history, theory, visualization, and technology and practice. Our students will be able to choose which of those requirements they're going to fulfill by formulating a project that's either a visualization project, a theory project, or a practice project. And so you can see here that this is a very rough sequence of the platform class that we'll teach each week, which will be a lecture, followed by a working discussion session. So what we're trying to do is try to jump from the disciplinary interests of the particular faculty that we have to something that's a more coherent platform for this discussion across the entire curriculum. Now, I want to touch briefly on at least some of the experimentation that we've got going on at Yale, just to touch on research, and then I'll close the discussion here. One of my students is doing a very interesting research project on trying to understand the relationship between black space and artificial intelligence image generation. And she started by doing this set of exercises to generate images of cities across the world. This is a city in Africa. This is a city in North America, which kind of harkens back to some unholy combination of, I don't know, New York and someplace. We asked the model, what is this city? And it said it was Chicago, because it seems to think it sees the Sears Tower there. This is an Asian city. This is a European city. And then I thought this one was super interesting. Show us a city in Australia. So we get this image. Now tell us what you've seen. Where is it? Say digitally rendered conceptual futuristic landscape. At least that was pretty close. So apparently, for whatever reason, the black box has decided that cities in Australia are conceptual and futuristic in nature. She's taken this exercise kind of to the next step to try to understand whether there is some dynamic between how these tools work and what images they produce and what images they're not capable of producing, particularly when her particular interest is around black space. We've been doing some training of our own large language models as research platforms for our students. And then I got very interested in this question of professionalization and registration validation and its relationship to these large language models. And I kind of argued in my book that the infrastructure of our profession is not really ready to deal with this because it moves slow and we move fast. Brian Potter, who writes a very interesting Substack called Construction Physics, did a quick test with GPT-4 last year to see how it did on the NCARB, in the US Canadian NCARB licensing exam. It did pretty well on the text-based parts, which is interesting, and raises some very interesting questions about what we should be testing people on. I've been doing my own experiment recently with our own platform. My license to practice architecture is in the state of California, where we have to do a ton of continuing ed. So every 2 years, I have to take a ton of these talking head tests about California Handicap Code and zero energy. So we took 15 of these tests and used various training techniques on our own platform to see how they did. And in a lot of cases, they did better than I did, which is interesting. We're going to write a paper on this. But it's not, I don't think this is a question of can large language models, pass minimum standards for architects. I think it's a question of what should we really be teaching, and what is the real definition of professional certification in the future, and what constitutes professional competence. creating glib images and looking up answers in text models, all of those things are going to be delegated to the internet. And so I think there's ultimately a question of what we decide is most important. And what I would argue is we're in extremely early days with this kind of image generation and language stuff, and we need to push the profession and the technologies and our teaching along to be much more oriented around these questions of outcomes. So I want to finish just briefly with an overview of what's happening on our campus. Yale is a very disaggregated empire. It is a series of operational units of various degrees of influence, with only some central control by the provost's office. But the provost did form recently a faculty task force with 12 members of the faculty to sort of figure out, what was going on at Yale and what we should be doing as an institution about this question. I've been a member of this task force and can't talk about it in detail, but I can show you kind of the template. And really what we've decided to do as an institution is organize AI efforts to try to understand it and support it around 4 categories: research, education, preservation of cultural heritage, and practice. And so the way that's been set up is around these 4 categories. There's this big task force. Well, we're not so big, there's only 12 of us. We've been interviewing research panels that are coming from the various operational units and trying to find out what's happening in places like our museums, our medical infrastructure, and our operations facilities and administration. And then the plan is for the provost to make certain kinds of investments in that. This is a kind of detailed diagram of all the stuff that's happening around that, around essentially providing support for things that are happening. And really the conclusion is the campus can really provide support around capabilities, access to software, and data infrastructure, because the things that are happening on the campus are so widely disparate. I mean, I'm doing experimentation around professional registration, and over in our clinical practice group at the med school, they've got 50 pilots going on around medical outcomes. And so the idea is that the university is going to create a kind of center that creates catalysts and supports pilots and is a convening, but that the work has to happen in a sort of decentralized way. And so what we've talked about and what we've decided to do as an institution is, there's an interesting report that you should read from Cornell from 2023 that creates a kind of AI teaching framework and lays out 3 AI teaching strategies, what we call no AI, okay AI, and go AI. And no AI is you cannot use any AI in your classroom. Okay AI is okay to use it, but make sure it's controlled and it goes with attribution. Or go AI is fully integrated into your classroom in a kind of intentional way. And so at Yale, we are definitely using a combination of okay and go. Our Center for Teaching and Learning is creating this center. We're about to build an AI compute infrastructure here. We're going to build a center that supports things and sort of helps folks along as they try to figure this out. So I want to make 2 more observations about this question as it regards where our students seem to be most attractive, which is around generative AI. And as I hope you can conclude from my presentation here, I'm a little bit skeptical of where this thing can go and how it can be useful. This company, Gartner, does this thing called the hype cycle, where they talk about what happens in the life cycle of brand new disruptive technologies. And it's a sequence of somebody has an innovation, everybody thinks it's the next big thing until it gets to the peak of inflated expectations. Then everybody figures out that maybe it doesn't work as well as we thought, so they drop into the trough of disillusionment. Then they figure out what it's actually useful for, which they call the slope of enlightenment. And then eventually we get to the plateau of productivity. I just want you to know that generative AI, which is the thing that our students and everybody are so excited about right now, is at the peak of inflated expectations. And I hope I've demonstrated to you that perhaps, at least for what we do, those expectations don't meet reality. And so the way I've been talking about our students about this question is from a paper that an architect named Stanford Anderson wrote in 1969 called Problem Solving versus Problem Worrying. And problem solving was this concept that it was something that architects were really worried about in the early 70s, that computers and algorithms were going to take their place. And Anderson posited that design was something that he called problem worrying, which is where you don't know what the answer is and you have to search for it, and you don't know where it's found. And Colin Rowe wrote about heuristics as opposed to algorithms. And there are a series of outcomes of the design process that are on the right side of this diagram that I just drew that are really about worrying about things like, how do you actually solve a carbon problem? When is something beautiful? When is it inspiring? And there's a bunch of stuff on the left-hand side that's about problem solving, like how much energy does this thing work and use, and how much code, how compliant is it to code? But there's also a bunch of stuff in the middle that is some combination of the two. Is it carbon neutral? Is it efficient? Is it safe? Is it secure? And what I would argue is, as architects, one of the things that we do that are really important are on the middle and right side of this diagram, and that we should be deploying technologies to solve the problems on the left and help us with the problems in the middle on the right. And that the real opportunity of AI immediately is on the left-hand side of this diagram, not on the right-hand side. That it may create, image generators may create provocations, but they can't solve problems. And what we really need to be worried about as both educators and practitioners is this structure that we have of the academy and the profession is uniquely unsuited to solve this problem because it moves so incredibly slowly. That certification, accreditation requirements, and even curricula move really, really slowly. So I think it's really very much up to us in the academy to push this thing along as quickly as we possibly can and bring the rest of the profession along with us. Now, I'll conclude with a final thought that maybe none of this is an issue at all. Maybe what the real issue is maybe the fact is if we can really get to generalized artificial intelligence. This was a cartoon that was in the New Yorker last year. The smarter we make the AI, the less it wants to do our jobs. So maybe there's no concern whatsoever that we're going to be replaced. There'll be plenty to do. So with that, I guess, Doug, we can take some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil. This has been very, very, very well, interesting and illuminating. So
it's a lot of material.
No, well, but it's much appreciated. And so I'm just going to check if anybody would like to either raise their hand or put something in the chat. There's also a Q&A box. So anything that anybody would like to ask. Phil's with us for a little bit more, and I'm just looking for any questions. Oh, Sarah, would you like to ask a question? Oh. Okay. I'm just checking for hands. Actually, I have a question to start things off because you did mention the idea that there's no coherent kind of pedagogy emerging from this. Clearly, at Yale, they're working on some of these things, but you also noted that
yeah, they as us, but yeah, yeah, right.
But you also noted how slow the wheels of bureaucracy tend to move. Is there any other kind of, as you start to think about getting a coherent pedagogy going, how do you see that developing? I know you've showed us a number of examples, but is there any other examples you could share with us?
Well, this is a different situation than we, at least in our institution, have faced as a school of architecture, because there are kind of two phenomena that I want to observe, at least in terms of our pedagogy. One is in the early 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, for the Northeast, elite design schools, Harvard, Yale, MIT, Princeton, to a lesser extent, Columbia, it was a flat out arms race around technology. Who could provide the best technological infrastructure. And people bought a ton of computers, and we have 70 3D printers, and we've got robots and industrial strength laser cutters, but so there was all this technological infrastructure laid in, but we as a humanist institution, at least at Yale, we very much adhered to the principle that we don't teach tools for credit. Tools are instruments. And so an instrument is always a vector toward teaching some other objective. With AI, I don't think we can afford that luxury anymore. We can't say to a student, there's the only difference between a laser cutter and an X-Acto knife is the speed at which you can make a model. All right. Or I think we actually have to now really deeply examine the implications of autonomous algorithms and what it means to be a professional architect. And that question is so much in the water socially right now. Everything else up to this point has all been inside baseball, as we say here. All right. It's all been kind of, you say BIM to your grandmother, she doesn't know what you're talking about. But if you say artificial intelligence, she read about it on the cover of the New York Times. So I think we have an obligation to work out a theoretical basis while we're making sure our students are comfortable with the technology. But I think my problem as a teacher is to create a person who's a competent architect 10 years from now. And there's no way to speculate where this technology is going to be 10 years from now. No way. We just don't know. So we got to make them familiar with the landscape, make them comfortable with the ideas, get them into a theoretical frame that says some aspects of your practice are going to be controlled by autonomous algorithms, and hope to God they can handle it.
Yes, it's actually going to be quite a challenge. I do see that Mehdi has raised his hand. Would you like to ask a question?
And then Laura has a question in the chat too. Go ahead, Mehdi.
Hello,
Mehdi, thanks for leaving your camera on the whole time. At least I felt like I had an audience of one. I saw you shaking your head or shaking like, no.
I am a teacher, so I understand how it can be painful to talk to only monitors without any faces looking at you. Thank you very much. It was very fascinating talk. Thanks to Douglas and Athabasca University to facilitating this, to enjoy your conversation today. I have two questions. The first, since I am a educator and I'm really in love with the teaching and learning, what you have resources available at Yale, where we can find them, where those resources can be found. That's the first question regarding the teaching and learning tools or the publications that comes from the school. We can read that. And then second question is tied up to your final statement that you just said, that the future of architecture, we can teach the students a lot of theories and philosophy and every fascinating things to get the brain engaged. However, when you come outside as a practitioner, they have a real job to do, to basically do as everyday architects, they need to basically sign off on something. And how do you tie these two together? Sorry, it was lengthy, but thank you so much again.
Well, it's a great question, because I think generally speaking, the technologies that are available at school are often far ahead of what's available in an office. However, this situation is different because the omnipresence of artificial intelligence in the general workplace is a little bit different. It's not like, it's one thing to send somebody to an office where there's no laser cutter. It's something entirely different to send somebody to an office where they're not going to give you access to, ChatGPT or Gemini. And so I think our students are going to be the people who are actually the most familiar with what's happening when they graduate and transition immediately to practice. So in a way, the smart practitioners are going to look to these younger graduates to say, what are the real possibilities of these things? What are the possibilities in architecture? And I also think there's going to be a little bit of a lag because frankly, right now, most of the stuff out there is useless. It's not helpful in any kind of real way. And look, there's going to be a low-level thrum of just basic business transactional stuff that everybody's going to be able to do. AIs are going to take your meeting. I mean, I'm on the homeowners association board where I live. We had a board meeting on Saturday, and Zoom created the meeting minutes, which were way better than the meeting minutes that the elderly guy who was the secretary of our association can do, and we got them instantly. It usually takes him 3 weeks, right? So that kind of stuff, marketing, collateral, routine communication, all that stuff's definitely going to bubble up. I think it's a question of how to use it intelligently. But for the younger architects who are in the office, they're going to have to stay out ahead of what's new. So you got to throw them in the pool of what's new right now so they can watch it. Did I answer your question, Benny?
Yes, thank you so
Okay.
much. It was very
So
comprehensive.
I posted in the chat a link to the AI guidance from our Center for Teaching and Learning, and
Yes.
those guys are going to continue to put more stuff there. So
Thank you
that's
so
what we're
much.
gonna do.
I wrote your email address down, so in case if I have any questions, I'm gonna email you.
Okay. Sure.
Thank you.
So Doug, do you want me to answer this question from Laura?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So Laura's asked a question in the chat. If you open the chat, you can see it.
Yeah. Okay. So there's 2 questions in that chat. Question 1 is very similar to the questions that were being asked in 1991, 2003, and 2012, right? Which is drawing going to go away as a means of communication? And I think I have the same answer that I used to give when I was in the software business, which is it's not a dialectic. It's not a choice between one or the other. The students should be exposed to a broad range of tools. So our students can go down to our fabrication lab and they can use any one of our 12 robots, or as soon as a bunch of them are going to Rome in 3 weeks, and they're going to spend 6 weeks with sketchbooks and watercolors and pencils drawing. And I mean, this is simply an anecdotal observation from our institution, but we teach multiple drawing courses where people use their hands and their pencils. Our students draw a lot, and drawing is just another tool that they have for becoming good designers. And I think our job as educators is make sure they have opportunities to draw. And I think for you guys, Doug, this is particularly important because you're in an all virtual curriculum, where the coefficient of friction around the digital stuff is very low, and the coefficient of friction around hand drawing is higher, but you still got to make them do it, right?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, we have a number of drawing courses, and in our first 2 studios, we don't allow the use of computers at all. So people have to draw by hand and build their models by hand.
Right. And I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate pedagogical stance to take. And so it's interesting. Some of our older alums are very, very concerned about this until they come back to school and they see the work on the wall. And there's a lot of amazing hand drawing, but you have talented students. You got to make sure they know how to operate the back end of a pencil. Now, for your second question, Laura, I think this cat or whatever animal you want to choose is so far out of the bag at this point that you need to adopt school policies that reflect the fact that these tools are widely available to students, and they're going to use them whether you know it or not. And so our attitude about this is pretty straightforward. We are insistent that our students attribute their use of whatever tool they're using. So, and not doing so, frankly, is a violation of our very strict plagiarism regulations. And so we say to our students, you're free to use these tools in whatever way you see is appropriate, but you must source them. You must give us the sources of what you're using. And if you're editing AI generated texts, you need to generate it. You need to attribute it. And I think what I'm seeing, look, some of my older colleagues are like, forget about all this. I'm going to start giving handwritten proctored exams with no computation. That's an option. But some of the more enlightened colleagues on campus are saying, okay, if we're going to start with AI generated output, let's look at whether it's any good, and let's critique it and let's improve it so you can learn how to, think. But, as I was reminded by some podcast I was listening to this week, Socrates argued that writing was going to destroy humanistic endeavor because people would no longer remember things and tell stories. So I think this is just the next step in that. So it's up to you as a teacher to figure out what the best way to deploy this technology is in your classroom to improve what students are producing and not as a shortcut. I hope that wasn't too glib an answer.
Laura is thanking you in the chat. So thank you, Laura, for that question. I'm just looking, are there other hands or other questions that people would like to ask? Oh, okay, here's one in the Q&A. George writes, excellent and enlightening lecture. Are architects at the risk of being outcast in the AI universe? What are some of the cross-pollination processes or models that are out there between our profession and the computing fields?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of cross-pollination, and I don't think in the foreseeable future we're going to be replaced by these machines. There are too many constraints right now. In my view, I think there are just too many boundary conditions. There are boundary conditions around the accessibility of compute power and how much it costs. Right. Right now, a training run of one of the large language models costs $500 million. That's how much it costs to do a foundation model training run right now. And I don't believe that architects are going to be in any danger until we start to see the emergence of spatial foundation models, and we're not there yet. So that's one constraint. There's a whole second constraint around whether or not we're going to delegate the fundamental responsibility of human architects to machines. Are machines going to sign and seal drawings? Are they going to take personal responsibility? So there are all these kinds of constraints. Having said that, I think there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of computational activity out there. There's a lot of the computer science world, or the computer science startup world, is all. There's a tremendous amount of potential for new algorithms to emerge. And I think as a profession, we should pick and choose the ones we think are most important and nurture those, and be strategic about it. Because I think ultimately that some of the basic stuff that we do as architects, like code checking and producing technical working drawings and, checking samples, some of that kind of low level transactional stuff is all going to get computerized. And so it's up to us to accelerate our value proposition and be clearer about what we think is important about architecture and what we're willing to take responsibility for. Because a lot of the easy stuff is absolutely going to get automated. You can already see it. 3 years from now, no human is going to be designing a Starbucks or a McDonald's or a Walmart or a Home Depot, right? Somebody's going to be stamping those drawings, but those are all going to be machine generated. Maybe we don't care so much about that, but we do care about more important problems. And those are the ones I think we should be solving. For some reason, I'm not seeing the Q&A. Where's the Q&A, Don?
Let's see, there should be along the bottom between pause, stop recording, and show captions. I have a QA button.
Oh, I don't get that. Oh, what? Maybe it's here. Hold on.
Maybe it's
Sorry.
because
Oh, there it is. Here it is. I got it.
yeah, yeah.
Got it. Okay.
It is an interesting question, though, professionally. As you say, it does seem quite feasible in the near future that Walmarts and McDonald's and Starbucks would be um, generated. But would they? You can also see that some people in the AEC industry would then push to say, well, do we need a human stamping these drawings? Or if it passes code, if it can be shown to pass code, uh, is it enough?
Yes, I think there will, for the foreseeable future, they need a human to sign and seal those drawings because they need somebody to sue. All right.
True.
I mean, I hate to put it in
Yeah.
such blunt terms, but at least in your country and in my country, that is the ultimate, you know, uh, I like to kid my students that the last phase of an architect services is litigation, right? Um,
Yes, that should be put into the diagrams, shouldn't
yeah.
it? Construction document, litigation.
But at least for complex projects, um,
Yep.
and look, I don't think we're as far away from that as you think. When I was at Autodesk, we were doing a project for Starbucks where they were hyper standardizing all of their design on Revit templates. And when we first started the Revit exercise, I thought, okay, what's this? Where can we show some real value immediately? So I sent a team to Home Depot and said, hey, look, we can create Revit templates of your Home Depot working drawings, and you can crank those things out almost instantaneously. They said, we've already solved that problem in AutoCAD. It's less than this was in 2005, so this was 20 years ago. They said, we can have a set of permittable drawings in less than 3 weeks from the day we close on a piece of property. Ain't gonna get much faster than that, peeps.
Nope.
So, but they still have to have a human signing those drawings.
But it does speak to the interesting issue. Yes, it may only take 3 weeks to do the drawings, but to get it through the process of approval is extraordinary. Can be much longer than that, and that's where I'm wondering. At a certain point where it almost becomes an automated flow, and where a developer may well say, in answer to your question, well, I'll take on the liability if I don't have to hire these architects to stamp the drawings.
Yeah, no way. I don't think it's worth it.
Oh,
I don't.
really? Eh?
I would be shocked if no developer I know would ever do that because they want access to your insurance policy. But the more interesting question here, Doug, is actually a much more interesting question, which is, codes they're prescriptive, not descriptive, meaning they have to be interpreted. And the question is, can an algorithm that can't reason about the world interpret codes? It can certainly analyze little pieces of codes, but it cannot interpret codes. So can you replace a code official with an algorithm? Now, to do all the super boring stuff, like do all the doors swing in the right direction, and is the stair the right width, and is the firewall in the right place? Yes. But for the more complex, judgment calls, I'm not so sure.
Okay.
I'm
Although
not
you
so
were
sure.
showing an example of the company that you mentioned that was, well, they were only looking at the size of the bathrooms and things like that in terms of.
Yeah, they were doing things that I used to do when I was 26 years old, like reading the code and making a list of all the applicable provisions and going through the drawings and checking to make sure that a wheelchair can turn around in the bathroom and that the fire stair rail was in the right place.
Excellent.
But
I'm
maybe
just
look, I am not part of the breathless enthusiasm school of AI because I've been around
well,
long
that's
enough to see multiple AI winters.
yes. Well, that was the one surprising thing, because having followed the work of, you mentioned Marvin Minsky and the work that he was doing so many years ago, and we were supposed to have an AI revolution, I think sometime around 1990 or something like that, or earlier, and it never, of course, materialized. But I'm looking for questions, but I had one more before I let you go. Is I'm fascinated by the example you gave of using AI to give students help with things like 3D printers you mentioned,
Yeah,
and
so it's
those
a low grade thing, but Go ahead.
Well, it is a low grade thing, but for us, and for students who often will be working late into the evening, when faculty members or technicians aren't available, I was really wondering if you could expand on that. What sort of different uses do you put it to, and does it work?
Well, we've been testing it. It seems to be working for certain kinds of questions. What we did, we had a training set, which was our technology team, because they get the same question over and over again all the time, are constantly documenting things. So there's extensive written documentation about lots of stuff. So we use that. We also have a ticketing system. Students can't just, burst into the office and say, I can't get this 3D printer to work. They have to open a ticket in a ticketing system where they ask the question and then we write out an answer. And so we're using the ticketing system and all of our documentation to do the training. And so far look, if they set a laser cutter on fire, it's not going to help. But for basic kind of stuff like how high off the cutting surface do I need to set the blade on the Zune printer, it's pretty good at that stuff. Pretty good at that kind of low level. Help me, it's 2 o'clock in the morning stuff. And I mean, this is the same thing lots of businesses are doing. This is the same thing as, the automated voice system that you get when you try to reach out for help from a lot of places. It's very low hanging fruit. You should do it.
Well, yes, there's a lot of instances where it would really help us, help our students, and particularly because so many of our students work during the day, they're only working on their assignments in the evening. So it would be a wonderful, was certainly something that we're considering. I don't want to keep you any longer because we've really enjoyed this, but we know your time is valuable. I'm just looking any last comments. I've got the Q&A open, I got the chat open, and I'm looking for hands, but I'm not seeing anything. So I think all that remains is to thank you for very much, Phil. I know the work that you've been doing over decades is quite incredible, and for you to share it with us is a great experience for us all. And I just wanted to thank you and to everybody who's participated in this lecture series. We've had some fabulous speakers and we've learned an incredible amount. So thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for attending. And with that, we will wrap this up. And again, Phil, I will connect you with Philip Beasley, and safe travels. And
thank you.
Thank you again.
All right. Cheers, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Have a good day.